like my friend on the phone, that we should add a couple of questions in such conversations. Things like, what do you do for the life of the community? What is your service activity? Or what have you done today for the common good? And to enter into our conversations that way, reaffirming the value of that common good, the collective community for which we're assuming responsibility. These are the right questions to help us focus on our civic responsibility. These are essentially and especially important questions in the current context of so much frustration and hostility directed at public life and social responsibility. We've got a long way, we are a long way from focusing on those civil questions about the common good. When Senate Leader Mitch McConnell said in an interview 10 years ago this month, the single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president. I would say, no, that's not the single most important thing. The single most important thing is to figure out how best we can work together as a community to address major problems that we see. Years ago, the journalist and public philosopher Bill Moyers captured the context in which we work today in a statement he made representing the basis of civility in government. He said, "We live in short in a very collective, very organized society in which we are all connected, in which the welfare and safety of each one of us is dependent on the health and wealth of a cooperative and collective enterprise. Government has become bigger and more centralized, not because we have become careless of our freedoms or morally lazy in our commitment to individual values, but because the important tasks that need to be done in our nation today are beyond the reach of single men and women, making our society work. The flourishing of civilization is everyone's business. It is what we do. Our individual freedom depends upon our participating memberships in democracy." Thank you.
I always get the opportunity to follow very easy acts. And that was a very intelligent presentation. I appreciate that. A little bit of contrast, going back to the beginning of Lynn's comments, indicated that when polled, legislators and our elected officials came in with an 8% rating. I'm privileged to be in a group that has a lower rating. Lawyers are often right at the bottom. So I think we've had an intelligent perspective in terms of public communication, and we're going to have a very personal one from Rebecca. And I'm sort of the middle ground here, I think, where I'm supposed to provide the contrarian position to give you some sense of that. I sometimes start out a presentation reminding people I'm a lawyer. Shakespeare was famously quoted as saying, "Brevity is the soul of wit." I can show you a bunch of paper here that suggests to you that this won't be brief, but then lawyers were never supposed to be very funny. But in honoring that all of you are here, I will try and be mindful that Shakespeare also said, "Let's kill all the lawyers." I appreciate the invitation, Marion. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm just going to cover a little bit of my background and then try and give you, I guess, a couple of pearls of wisdom that have sort of come from about 30 years of practicing law and participating as a mediator and a problem solver, if you will, which is really how I view my practice. I became a general civil mediator in 1997. And in 1998 was approved also for domestic relations. So I've been involved in helping people try and resolve disputes that they have, often when they're framed in the form of litigation, but for quite some time. I've been practicing law since 1980, but for the past 20 years, my practice has essentially been oriented towards, at least for this region, larger institutional type of clients, some of them governmental bodies, some large nonprofits. And I also serve on several boards, as indicated by Marion. 2 of those are public. And as a consequence of that, I've learned that in order to get things done, you have to try and focus your communication in a manner where it's going to be problem solving and solution driven. And part of my practice as a mediator and an arbitrator is also kind of focused in that area. A little bit of background too. In 1995, I was originally introduced to mediation by someone many of you may know, Pete Doran, local attorney. He had been a long time attorney for the city of Traverse City. And Pete was one of the first in our legal field in the early 1990s to actually speak, if you will, in public settings in a way that would elicit questioning. And I was fascinated by it, and it involved several lunches, usually I was buying, but Pete shared with me that those were principles that came from mediation training, and he encouraged me to do it. And this led to one of the first revelations that I've had. Sometimes I have them frequently, but some are more important than others. But how I was going to use communication, and it certainly has directed the way that I practice law. And it is this: communication is enhanced when you realize that learning issues from your opponent's perspective offers options to solve problems. Let me repeat that. Communication is enhanced when you realize that learning issues from your opponent's perspective offers options to solve problems. Very much the foundation of what Lynn was speaking to. Now, think of it a little bit from my perspective. This was a hard concept for lawyers to swallow. Lawyers don't think like that. We advocate strongly, and we sometimes interpret our advocacy as negotiating and persuasion. But the fact of the matter is we like to control the mic. We like to control the discussion. And that can be very problematic from the standpoint of understanding the perspectives that are coming into either a public setting or into a dispute, which can be very personal as well, that you're trying to resolve. But I learned that by using open-ended questions to develop an understanding of the issues that are viewed from different perspectives offers insight to me, and that insight is really power. It's the way that you learn, if you will, to walk a mile or two in the shoes of another person. And it often tends to create a dialogue. And now you're working. Now things are starting to happen. So if you can learn the perspectives that are being discussed, and you can engage in a dialogue on those perspectives, you have an opportunity to create a foundation of some respect, which is really what Lynn was speaking to, and some trust in terms of keeping that communication going. And I think most importantly, once you have that perspective, it opens up the possibilities to solve the issue that you're trying to address in a way that's acceptable to you, which is an important piece of this. You don't go into negotiation or advocacy of a public issue from a standpoint that you want to lose that point. The fact of the matter is you want a solution that's acceptable to you. But what's important, if you're going to resolve that issue without some type of mandatory fact finder like a judge, you have to have an issue that's acceptable to the person that you're also addressing the issue with. So it's got to be acceptable to the other side. This basic philosophy, in my opinion, is really the core of mediation. Some of you have been through mediation training, and some of you are actively involved in public issues. My personal problem, this is a problem that's personal to me in terms of acting as a mediator, is that I can be very impatient. I like to push people into these insights and get them moving more quickly, if you will, to solutions, as opposed to creating an environment where each side opens up, which is really the facilitative process of mediation, discusses their concerns, is open to establishing if you will, an agenda of how you can resolve those, and working to try and do that, again, through open-ended questions, eliciting that information, and then the mediator usually tries some reflection back on what's being heard at periodic points in time, trying to build some consensus on some of these sub-issues and moving ahead. That works, and it's in a very effective process, but it's also in a controlled environment. And as I mentioned, litigation is also a mechanism of solving disputes, but it's finalized and it's actually giving up the control. And mediation and litigation certainly have their point of view, but I view the discussion today is really one of which, what are some lessons we can take to work in a public environment, to work in either public issues that are affecting us, and how do we represent those to our governmental officials? How do we manage public meetings so that we can have that kind of conversation? And a few years ago, I was introduced in a training program to something called conflict coaching. And it's very similar to mediation, except your skills that are used to coach a person or a group through a conflict to reach a solution are a little bit different than a facilitator trying to create an environment for everyone. And that's really when I had maybe one of my second guiding principles, if you will, in terms of how I try and conduct myself in public. And that is this: conflict exists in every dispute. Managing conflict to accomplish objectives is an effective way to communicate. You don't run from conflict. It's a part of why you're there. And you have to get comfortable that the conflict that's occurring, whether it's in an organizational communication setting, sometimes a family, or in a larger public arena where it's probably more easily identifiable, the conflict is there. And then the process of conflict management generally follows this pattern. And I'm only going to touch on it. If any of you want to talk about it further, it's an area of study, and it really can't be covered in a couple of minutes. But to try and give you at least a general idea of how I perceive it. First of all, you do identify the conflict that's occurring in this public setting of discussion. And secondly, you try and identify what your objective is. What are you trying to accomplish in the perspective that you're bringing into this public arena? The third is you then create a scenario which attains your objective and resolves the conflict. In effect, when you go through the training, you tell your own story, but you do this privately. What is it, what scenario is out there in my perfect world that resolves this conflict I'm having with these people, and my objective is the one that's ultimately approved, either by the governmental body or whatever the organizational situation is. And then you have to determine if that scenario is realistic. So that's when you take a step back and you try and attach the same principle to the other perspective. What scenario is going to work for them? What is actually driving the concerns from the other side? It's that element of learning enough or thinking enough about the issues that are being presented from the other side that you can begin to understand them. And that's when power starts to occur. When you understand what the other side is trying to accomplish, you have a much better means, if you will, of presenting your story in such a way where it's acceptable. And again, you start to increase that dialogue that's occurring. You have to be prepared to acknowledge that you may not resolve all the conflict that exists between you, but you usually can reduce it when you try and think of things from the perspective of the other party. And once you do that, you finalize your scenario, if you will, and you present it, and then you continue to work to shape it. But you have to appreciate, and at least I've learned that, to accept the fact that conflict is often a part of these conversations, and I don't want to tell people you embrace it. I don't want to ever tell people that it's necessarily comfortable to everybody. It's not even comfortable to lawyers. But what you do want to learn is a process where you can try and manage that. And usually that occurs by re-establishing the focus on the objectives of the public purpose that you have in front of you. Walk that mile in the shoes of the other person. It's very much like the mediation process. Okay, probably that took us a little bit astray. Did not mean to do that, but I do have a couple of examples that I think might be illustrative of how the process can actually work. And I've tried to pick some that are not confrontational, but how can you build some consensus, and then a couple of situations that we had to address in a more formal setting. About 20 years ago, I was privileged to participate in a training program on consensus building. And the trainer emphasized the Quaker model of community. In fact, a couple of people here I think may have actually been in that first training, and many of you are familiar with the concept of the Quaker community. At its core, the Quaker community moves forward through consensus building, which is the opposite of taking a vote. The majority prevails when you take a vote. It's a process, a set of rules that govern most of how we look at solution building. And so in a public setting, if we're presenting perspectives on different points of view, presenting them, if you will, to a county board of commissioners, to a planning commission, to a township board, what have you, that's our local mechanism, if you will, of governmental involvement. And ultimately a decision is going to be made, just like in court. But under a consensus building model, there's a process that involves discussion through a facilitated meeting. And so a designated facilitator is established, and that facilitator then identifies the issues or concerns that are being raised and reflects back to the group the solutions that he or she hears being proposed. And the members of that group, and in the Quaker Society, again, remember that's the focus of this training, the members in that group are challenged to consider their beliefs of the common good for the community. And again, that reflects on a theme that Lynn was referencing. You have to have a creation of a focus on the common good within the group that you're talking about. And so that emphasis is sort of built into the core belief system within a Quaker community. If a person still believes that there's validity in the opposition to the position, the discussion continues. And the facilitator continues to call on people and allow discussion to occur until no one wants to be heard anymore. And again, you reflect on those solutions that are out there to that issue. And you ask if anyone has anything further to say. And if that person remains committed to the position for the benefit of the group, that position continues to be articulated. That person will be called upon again to speak. And consensus has not been reached, and consequently, the issue is not ultimately resolved. The process begins again, generally in a different setting, but ultimately, the objective in the Quaker community is to build that consensus. It is also possible that that person, through the course of discussion, and let's fast forward through a couple of these sessions, that person may ultimately realize that the common good of the community is going to be met by a portion of that solution being addressed in the way that it's been proposed. That person can then stand aside, recognizing that the principles of their concern are still valid, but they'll stand aside from what will be in the common good of the general group. And in doing so, then consensus is reached and an opportunity goes forward. Now, none of us is so naive as to believe that that's something that can occur in every public forum. And our challenge today really is to apply this Quaker form of consensus building when the common good may not have that same definition to every member of the public. And I think all of us are pretty familiar with that situation, that it doesn't really exist. But all that being said, I do believe, and I was reflecting on it when I was preparing for this and looking at my notes from that training, consensus building works for many public discussions, especially when there is a strong informational foundation that's built as that conversation goes forward. Now, by way of example, I serve on a couple of public boards, and I recently stepped down as the chair of the Traverse City Downtown Development Authority, and I've been a member of the DDA for quite a few years. We have a number of difficult issues that come before us relative to development downtown, but one of the things that comes up on a regular basis is the use of a tool called tax increment financing. And, both in the Leelanau newspapers and Traverse City newspapers, you read plenty of information about TIF or tax increment financing. What we've tried to do over the course of the years as a DDA is at least on not less than an annual basis, even if we don't have a particularly new project coming forward, we hold public hearings about tax increment financing. We advertise it to the public. And the purpose of the conversation, it's a facilitated meeting. And we talk about what it is, what the legal requirements are, how it's established, a couple of the projects that we've used it for, and provide some educational foundation for how it works. And we invite the public to comment, and we have that kind of conversation. And generally, through the course of the discussion, people become comfortable that there are uses for the tool, and that they begin to understand it better. And we find that helps us set a foundation. So approximately 3 times a year, we try and have public meetings in the evening, which are really just an opportunity for us to set a foundation, to listen to what the public is thinking about the issues that are in front of us. And we found that it begins to create some confidence, at least in the actions of our board, on our regular monthly meetings, that the public knows that we're trying to listen and we're trying to pay attention. There are times when we've got specific issues in front of us, and I'll try and give you just a quick example, but for instance, when we built our first parking deck, and we now have 2 and are on the way to a 3rd in downtown Traverse City, we tried to make certain during that process that we discussed the need that existed for parking, which was to try and create a common foundation. Here's what we perceive as the need, and engage the community to identify whether it agreed that that need existed, and if so, how did they think it should be fulfilled. And so we're looking at both the needs and the benefits of trying to coordinate parking in the manner that we were thinking of through the construction of the deck, and to find out what the concerns were. We tried to create a number of public hearings where we engaged people to tell us what their concerns were. It could be the cost. And as a result of that, we created a matrix with the city treasurer to identify exactly how the cost would be addressed. It could be traffic patterns, it could be height, it could be whether or not there were other utilities related to the use of that building. And we tried to listen to what those concerns were, identify what they were, and then come back, if you will, at the next meeting by showing that we were addressing that information and trying to build that into what ultimately would be a better project. So, again, what I'm suggesting here is that your first tact in terms of dealing in the public arena, I think, is being prepared to move slowly, to engage the public, to embrace transparency, and to create an informational base on the particular issue that's important, and be open to a lot of discussion about what the concerns are, and then make certain that those concerns are being addressed. The most important thing I've learned is that when people raise their hand and ask a question, they want to know that they've been heard. And sometimes, and you've all probably been in meetings where people will repeatedly raise the same point 2 or 3 different times during the meeting. If you gave them an opportunity during public comment, they might get up there 3 or 4 different times. Essentially, they're saying the same thing. The reason they're saying it is because they don't believe they've been heard. It's amazing, but if you reflect back to those people that you hear what their concerns are, and you indicate a commitment to try and address those concerns, a lot of the objections will go away. And at least that's a practical experience of mine. And so I think in its purest sense, consensus building in the public arena can exist. It requires time and a lot of effort to create a foundation of information and a willingness to create that dialogue by listening and hearing and reflecting that back. Now, sometimes opposition to action by a public body develops in a specific group that seeks out methods to prevent that project from moving forward. Gosh, have we ever seen that happen? In such a case, though, mediating or facilitating a discussion between those groups can be helpful. A few years ago, and I was just talking with Rebecca about this, the Conflict Resolution Service in Traverse City, in its early stages in the 90s, actually had a group of people, and I was privileged to be a part of that went through consensus training, and we actually put ourselves out there to the greater community to be available to facilitate meetings and to try and create some opportunity for a safe place for discussion to occur and help contentious issues be resolved. And one of those involved a dispute in Traverse City on Wayne Street, and it was really what I'm going to call the Wayne Street neighborhood issue. The city of Traverse City claimed to have straight road access on Wayne Street, and a subsidiary issue of that is that approximately, and any of you that may have been on that road, it's relatively flat out of just off of Garfield, and then it hits the base of Wayne Hill, and then it goes up fairly steep into what has become a very developed area of expensive homes that overlook Traverse City and the Bay. But at the bottom of the hill, it's a mixed community. There's a school, there's a park, and there's a general neighborhood sense. And as Wayne Street was developing up the hill, more traffic was occurring, and there were some issues that were happening there. On top of that, there was actually, because this was a platted subdivision, there was a road access to property behind the Wayne Street neighborhood to the north that had never been developed. The road had not been used. It was created on a plat map, but as far as the residents of the neighborhood were concerned, it was simply kind of a path that they used to get back to a backdoor area of the school. It was very convenient. It was part of what made the neighborhood important to them. Bottom line is that in an effort to try and thwart the city from creating an opportunity for this subdivision to be developed, some legal research was done, and it was determined that there was actually a gap in the legal description of Wayne Street, the road. Approximately 10 to 20 foot title gap existed, and when the upper portion of the hill was developed, it had never been completely coordinated title-wise to connect to the city street that was Wayne Street. It was originally shown to be a dead-end street. The interesting thing is that Michigan law provided opportunities for highway by user, and there was very little question that the city had the legal right to enforce that street, but it became kind of a strident issue. So that sets the stage. Sorry it takes so long with that. But what we had an opportunity to do was to step in at both the request of the city and the neighborhood and see if we could identify some solutions to this issue, because everybody was looking at lengthy litigation, and ultimately there was the possibility that this development would never occur. And the way that we approached in a mediated settlement, there were two mediators that were part of this. We spent quite a bit of time identifying the stakeholders, and I would suggest to you that in many public debates and disputes, that's really the issue. You've got to identify who the stakeholders are. So we made certain that all of the people that were in this general opposition group that considered themselves the Wayne Street neighborhood were at the table. And we spent a lot of time actually talking with them to find out what their concerns and their issues were. And that's when we really learned that their issue was that if this gap in the road existed, then ultimately the city could not develop the alley and road to lead to the access to the other subdivision that was going to be developed. And at the heart of it was their concern that the neighborhood that they had created and the safe area for their children was going to go away. Part of it came from the standpoint that there was increased traffic on Main Street. So by listening and hearing that, we understood that the issues were really a goal and objective to make certain that their property values didn't go down, their children could get to the school and the park. And so we engaged the city in the same discussion, and we also identified what the legal parameters were relative to this title issue. And as a result of that, through the conversation, by identifying that there really were other issues that were more important to the Wayne Street neighborhood, the city was able to accommodate them. They put in restrictions on speed limit, they put in speed bumps, There were communications that were intentionally made to the residents at the top of the hill. Access points to the school and access points to the park were identified. And as a result of that, a solution was resolved. The subdivision ultimately was developed. The